So for class, we watched Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, and I loved the movie. It became my new fixation. Really fun. I became insufferable for a while. But there was this one specific scene in it that like really stuck in my mind. It's the scene where the landlady, Mrs. Sun, tells Mrs. Chan to be careful because people are talking about her going out and meeting Mr. Chow. In class, the professor actually talks about the surveillance kind of quality of neighbors because of such close proximity that they live in and the overcrowded nature of Hong Kong. This kind of discussion that we had in class just really reminded me of a previous discussion in class where we were talking about Lu Xun and kan ke. This leads me to my question. In regards to Chinese culture, what is the relationship between kan ke and gossip culture? First, what is kan ke? Kan ke translates to onlookers or spectators, and the term is used to describe this phenomenon among a crowd watching a spectacle. Chinese writer Lu Xun actually criticized kan ke wenhua, or culture of the gaze, where people would look without action, specifically in Chinese society. It reflected the ignorance, impassiveness, conservativeness, and feudal nature of ordinary people. They were silent, curious spectators in public, but gossiped about events in private. Ultimately, Lu Xun was kind of criticizing the apathy found within kan ke. I think this was best exemplified in Lu Xun's work, A Public Example. In this short story, a crowd forms around a prisoner, but the story focuses on the people in the crowd rather than the actual prisoner. And it largely describes their behaviors and like their physical appearances. For example, when the policeman raises his foot, everyone rushes to observe it, thinking it's some sort of exciting event. And one character is described to have a pair of blue trousers topped by a mountainous bare back, down which waterfalls of sweat were cascading. Basically, because there is so much focus on the crowd gapes at a spectacle, but the crowd is actually part of the spectacle itself. So that's basically kan ke in like a really short abridged version. But there are also other related concepts that kind of branch off of it. The first branch, I guess, would be weiguan, which translates to surrounding gaze, referring to the crowd surrounding a target. Some define this as a cultural phenomenon, meaning the drawing a crowd of people to see a problematic event or issue while not being involved in any way in trying to solve the problem by intervening in the event itself. This phenomenon is perhaps best known in the West as an exaggerated version of the passerby effect, or bystander effect. Weiguan ultimately emphasizes the inaction of the crowd and is a part of kan ke. Therefore, in my opinion, kan ke has or creates the weiguan, and weiguan is a part of kan ke. Another concept that branches off of kan ke is shizhong. Shizhong is the means of punishing offenders through disgracing and shaming, and literally translates to show to the public. Basically, shizhong is supposed to show a warning or a threat to the public, and kind of making an example out of the person being punished for others to learn from. A little bit going into the history or origin of shizhong, I found a paper by my professor. I swear I didn't know it was by her until after I started using it. But she asserts that shizhong has to do with an age-old Chinese obsession with public exposure, wherein it displays the condemned or evil of others in public. Shizhong basically represents the act of making punishment a spectacle and proposes it to have a dual meaning, where it reveals the encircling and gawking crowd as spectacle, as well as making the crowd encircle and gawk. Shizhong is actually still used today as part of the shaming culture within China. Not like officially, but there are still some occurrences. And a recent example is in 2021, 4 men were prosecuted for smuggling people across Chinese borders when the country was closed due to COVID restrictions. These men were walked by police throughout the city in hazmat suits with posters of their faces and their names. And a state-run news outlet said, the disciplinary action deterred border-related crimes and encouraged compliance with epidemic prevention and control. This kind of endorsement by the state echoes the now outlawed practice of parading prisoners around town as part of their punishment. This statement specifically confirmed the action as intending to set example for the rest of the public. In regards to shaming culture specifically, there's a little bit of a difference in the conceptions of Eastern versus Western, but this quote pretty much sums it up pretty well. In shame-based cultures, public humiliation, scorn, or censure are relied upon more heavily to keep individuals in obedience, whereas the Western notion of guilt and corrective behaviors comes from an individual's development of an internal conscience. So, within Asian cultures, and Chinese culture specifically, there's a great emphasis on filial piety and collectivism, resulting in an interdependence on one's family and a blurring of identity between the self and the community. Therefore, shame impacts more than just one person, and can be experienced collectively, starting within the family system, according to psychotherapist Sam Louis. He actually connects cultural honor with shame, explaining that they coexist together to bring harmony, cohesion, and order to Asian countries. Shame is then seen as necessary in order to bring about honor, thus the great emphasis in using shame as part of one's education within society. So how is this related to kan ke? I didn't forget about her. 示众 brings about the kan ke. So basically, 示众, or public humiliation or spectacle, draws in a 看客 or onlookers and prompts the 看客 to gawk. So 示众 is the phenomenon in which 看客 is intentionally created. To get really crazy and connect all three, 示众 invites 看客 to weaponize and learn from the 围观. Pivoting to the second part of my investigation, analysis, something. What is gossip? Dictionary.com, my one true love, defines it as idle talk or rumor, especially about the personal or private affairs of others. I feel like a lot of people often think of it as a negative thing, where it's the spreading of rumors or lies that disparage one's reputation, and often publicizing one's own private business. However, gossip also has a further use, where psychology professor Tanya Lombroso believes that gossip aids in establishing and communicating an individual's reputation, and this system for monitoring reputation can, in turn, help foster cooperation. In this way, gossip acts as a sort of method to inform others of one's character, as well as communicate social rules. She also asserts that gossip includes sharing negative judgments about a third party, but the shared information could protect the recipient from antisocial behavior or exploitation. So, gossip protects the listener by ways of observational learning, however, at the subject's expense. Gossip itself has its own history, with specific connotations based on gender. Yay! Before modern means of communication, gossiping was one of the only viable ways to exchange information due to the reliance on spoken word at the time. People used to have things called friendship meetings during the Middle Ages in order to share all kinds of news with each other, both public and private. Although gossiping is a gender-neutral activity, the Middle Ages was a time period that separated genders into spheres, public and domestic. I bet you can guess who goes where. But women were largely detained to the domestic sphere, also known as the household. However, when women gossiped during this time, they often did it in public, which consequently positioned women's gossip as shameful and dangerous because it breached these social boundaries. So, aligning with misogyny, as most things usually do, women's gossiping was deemed inappropriate and sinful, while men's gossip was praised for bringing about ideas and sharing important information. But thinking of gossip culture in a Chinese context specifically, Chinese literature professor Jack Chen asserts that what is transmitted within the cultural memory as literature and history was once the subject of social talk, and it is through the process of such talk that the tradition comes to take shape. So, in this way, history and literature are constructed through gossip, which also influences tradition, therefore ingraining gossip into a culture's foundation. Chen also argues that gossip and anecdote embodied tensions between public and private knowledge, between reliable and unreliable sources of information. So through gossip, stories become legend, fact, tradition, constructing a reality that is agreed upon and built by all those who participate in sharing the information. Even in modern times, gossip is still deeply ingrained into the culture. This is also because of living conditions. As places urbanized and grew upwards when there was no more room to grow outwards, the close proximity people lived in helped create conditions that encouraged gossip. Seeing the same people on a daily basis, knowledge of their habits or life due to the lack of privacy, these elements kind of gave people the ability to notice changes and speculate on reasons why they went through these changes. You can kind of see this in some scenes in The Moon for Love. Mrs. Sun, I don't know how to say her name, I'm sorry. Mrs. Sun the landlady actually talks to her friends about Mrs. Chan. This is like early on in the movie. Basically, this group of people, they are speculating on Mrs. Chan's whereabouts and her intentions. They notice a pattern in her habits, and they make assumptions of her life based on glimpses seen when passing in the hallways. There's also the scene that I mentioned earlier where Mrs. Sun confronts Mrs. Chan. At this point in the movie, it's not explicit that other people are talking about Mrs. Chan and Mr. Chow, but there's kind of an assumed talk or an implied talking of other people, and Mrs. Sun uses this alongside her observations in order to justify her assumption of what Mrs. Chan is doing, and then further act upon correcting Mrs. Chan's behavior, thus giving her this warning. One last clip from In the Mood for Love. There is this kind of acknowledgement of gossip within the movie. Both Mr. Chow and Mrs. Chan are kind of pushed to either be more careful about being seen together or just leave in general, like he went to Singapore. So these actions were incited by the gossip of others. This gossip pushed Mr. Chow and Mrs. Chan to conform to the majority and listen to others. Okay, let's finally compare them. 看客 and gossip culture. Here are some major differences. 看客 is more dependent on visuals, as it is an integral part of 看客 to see the one being punished. It hinges on the degradation of one's image, both physically and socially, as you are seeing the person being punished and that person's image or reputation is basically like ruined. 看客 also incites no action. The best action is no action. Continuing to live as normal as long as it's not like those who are being punished or who are on the receiving end of the 看客 is the assumed route of action. 看客 also used to be government sanctioned. Being paraded around and having like a sign inscribed with your crime was part of the sentence of prisoners on death row. 看客 originally was part of punishment, so it does not really have any positive connotations with it. And the idea or phenomenon of 看客 was identified originally as a critique of Chinese culture. Gossip, on the other hand, is oral dependent. You have this transmission of information through spoken word, and then this information then circulates through the community, all through just listening. This information is also not documented or written down anywhere. Gossip also encourages action, where gossip prompts gossipers to confront the subject or avoid the subject based on the nature of the gossip. Gossipers also act to inform others, so they spread information through a network. You hear one thing, you go and turn around and tell two other people. Gossip is not an organized effort or sanctioned by the government. Gossip is also a universal phenomenon, deeply entrenched in history with both good and bad connotations. Gossip also has the potential to kill, specifically with the actress Yuan Lingyu, and she ultimately committed suicide because of media and gossip. One of the more notable things about her suicide is that on the suicide note, she writes, "Gossip is a fearful thing." As a further comparison with the role of the spectator specifically, in 看客, the spectator just watches and has no further purpose. A spectator is part of 看客because of the inaction. With gossip, the spectator makes assumptions and draws conclusions and later shares it with others. However, there is one similarity that did stand out to me. Both are a type of surveillance. They both intend to enforce the kind of social norm, and they give this feeling of having eyes watching you. I mean, 看客, they literally are watching you, but in a way I feel like that both 看客 and gossip culture have the 微观, because the 微观 is either watching a spectacle or watching one's private life, which I guess technically would make the object of the gaze a spectacle. If watched closely enough, I guess maybe private life could become a spectacle. Which also leads me to another question. If no one is there to watch, does it count as a spectacle? That's all.